The blood-soaked sunset cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Sioux Falls, South Dakota Territory. 1878. As Hank Jenkins tightened his grip on his horse's reins, the muscles in his jaw clenching at the sight before him. A woman with copper hair was being dragged through the dirt by her wrists, her dress torn and mudded, her voice hoarse from screaming protests that nobody seemed to hear, nobody except Hank. Olivia Walker had been fighting against her captor's iron grip for what felt like hours, her wrists raw and bleeding, her lungs burning with each desperate plea for help. The man dragging her so-called fiancé, Thomas Reed, was taking her to the sheriff's office on false charges of theft, determined to see her locked away after she'd refused to marry him. "Let her go," Hank called out, his voice cutting through the evening air like a knife. He dismounted his horse in one fluid motion, his tall frame casting an imposing shadow as he approached. At 32, the years of hard work had shaped him into a man few would challenge without good reason. Thomas turned, his face contorted with rage. "This ain't your business, Jenkins. This woman's a thief and a liar." Hank's eyes flickered to Olivia, taking in her frightened expression, the desperation in her eyes. At 25, she was no helpless child, but the way Reed was handling her made his blood boil. "I said let her go." Hank's hand hovered near his holster, not as a threat but as a promise. "The hell I will," Thomas sneered, giving Olivia's arm another cruel yank that made her cry out. "She's promised to me, and she stole my mother's brooch when she tried to run. I didn't steal anything." Olivia's voice cracked with emotion. "He's lying because I wouldn't marry him. Please help me." People had gathered to watch the spectacle, but none had intervened until now. Sioux Falls wasn't a lawless town, but folks tended to mind their own business, especially when Thomas Reed was involved. His father owned the bank, which gave the family a certain untouchable quality. "Last chance, Reed," Hank said, his voice steady despite the anger coursing through him. He'd known Thomas since they were boys, had watched him grow into a cruel man who used his family's influence to get whatever he wanted. When Thomas's hand moved toward his gun, Hank was faster. In one swift motion, he had his revolver drawn and pointed. "You really want to die over this?" The crowd tensed. Thomas hesitated, then slowly released Olivia's wrists, his face flushed with humiliation. "You'll regret this, Jenkins. Your father should have taught you how to treat a lady," Hank cut him off. "Now get." Thomas spat in the dirt and backed away, his eyes never leaving Hank's face. "This ain't over." Hank holstered his gun only when Thomas had disappeared into the saloon across the street. He turned his attention to Olivia, who was cradling her injured wrists against her chest, trying to control her trembling. "You all right, madam?" he asked, keeping a respectful distance. "Yes, thank you," she managed, though her voice betrayed her. She was far from all right. "I don't know what I would have done if—" "No need to think on that now," Hank said gently. "Do you have somewhere to go? Family in town?" Olivia shook her head, her copper hair falling from its pins. "I was staying at the boarding house, but Thomas, he told Mrs. Gunderson I'd stolen from other boarders. She won't have me back." Hank frowned. Thomas had been thorough, cutting off her escape routes. "What about the sheriff?" "Sheriff Daniels is Thomas's uncle by marriage," Olivia said quietly. "He won't help me." The crowd had begun to disperse, losing interest now that the confrontation was over. But Hank knew better. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Thomas Reed wasn't a man who accepted defeat gracefully. "My ranch is about 5 miles outside of town," Hank said after a moment of consideration. "I've got a spare room where you can stay until we figure this out. My housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, is there proper as they come. You'll be safe." Olivia hesitated, looking at him with wary eyes. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." "Because it's the right thing to do," Hank said simply. "And I know enough about Thomas Reed to know you're telling the truth." After a moment, Olivia nodded. She had few options, and this stranger with kind eyes seemed to be offering her only chance at safety. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins." "Hank," he corrected, helping her onto his horse before mounting behind her. "Just Hank." As they rode out of town, neither of them could have known that Olivia would never leave Raven Creek Ranch again, at least not as Olivia Walker. The ride to Hank's ranch was mostly silent. Olivia sat stiffly in front of him, afraid to lean back against his chest, despite the discomfort of sitting side-saddle on a horse not meant for it. Hank respected her caution, keeping his hands firmly on the reins and giving her as much space as possible. "We're almost there," he said as they crested a hill. Below them, nestled in a valley with a creek winding through it, sat Raven Creek Ranch. It wasn't the biggest spread in Dakota Territory, but it was substantial, a two-story main house, a barn, stables, and several outbuildings. A few cowboys were visible in the distance, herding cattle into a pen for the night. "It's beautiful," Olivia said softly, the first words she'd spoken in miles. "Been in my family for 15 years, Hank replied. "My pa built it from nothing after we came west from Pennsylvania. Left it to me when he passed 5 years ago." As they approached the main house, a woman in her 50s emerged onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her expression was a mixture of surprise and curiosity. "Mrs. Abernathy," Hank called out as he helped Olivia dismount. "We have a guest." The housekeeper's eyes took in Olivia's disheveled appearance and injured wrists, and her expression softened immediately. "Oh, you poor dear. Come inside, let's get you cleaned up." Hank explained the situation briefly while Mrs. Abernathy prepared a basin of warm water and found clean bandages for Olivia's wrists. The older woman clucked disapprovingly when she heard Thomas Reed's name. "That young man has been trouble since he was in short pants," she said, gently washing the dirt from Olivia's wounds. "Always thought the world owed him something." "Thank you both for your kindness," Olivia said, wincing slightly as the water stung her raw skin. "I promise I won't impose for long. I just need a day or two to figure out where to go." Hank, who had been standing in the doorway of the kitchen, frowned. "Where will you go?" Olivia hesitated. "I have a cousin in Cheyenne. Perhaps she would take me in." "Well, there's no rush, Mrs. Abernathy said firmly. "You'll stay until you're properly healed at the very least. Mr. Jenkins, why don't you see to the horses while I show Miss Walker to the guest room, and tell Miguel we'll need hot water for a bath." Hank nodded and disappeared, leaving Olivia alone with the housekeeper. As soon as he was gone, Mrs. Abernathy's expression became more serious. "Now, dear, you can speak freely. Did that Reed boy hurt you beyond what we can see?" Olivia shook her head. "No, Mrs. Abernathy, he was cruel, but he never. It didn't get to that point. I managed to escape before the wedding. That's when he accused me of stealing." The older woman nodded, satisfied. "Good. And Mr. Jenkins, he behaved properly on the ride here?" "Yes, he was a perfect gentleman," Olivia assured her. She was touched by the woman's protective instincts. "In truth, I don't know what would have happened if he hadn't intervened." Mrs. Abernathy patted her hand. "Hank Jenkins is one of the good ones. His father raised him right before the consumption took him. Hank's been running this place on his own ever since, and doing a fine job of it, too." As promised, Mrs. Abernathy showed Olivia to a comfortable guest room on the second floor. A hot bath was brought up, and Olivia almost wept at the luxury of it after her ordeal. Mrs. Abernathy had provided a clean nightgown and robe, promising to mend Olivia's torn dress in the morning. "There are some dresses in the wardrobe that might fit you," the housekeeper explained. They belonged to Mr. Jenkins's sister before she married and moved to California. I'm sure she wouldn't mind you borrowing them." After her bath, Olivia found herself too restless for sleep, despite her exhaustion. She wrapped the robe tightly around herself and ventured downstairs, following the sound of quiet conversation to the study. She paused outside the partially open door, not wanting to interrupt. "Couldn't just leave her there, Mrs. Abernathy," Hank was saying. "You should have seen how Reed was treating her." "I'm not questioning your decision, Mr. Jenkins. I'm just concerned about the consequences. Thomas Reed isn't one to let things go, and his father holds the note on half the businesses in town." "Let him come," Hank said, his voice hardening. "The Reeds may have influence in town, but this is my land. Besides, I've known Nathaniel Reed long enough to know he won't back his son in this. Not if he learns the truth." "And what is the truth, Mr. Jenkins? You know this young woman well enough to vouch for her." There was a pause. "No," Hank admitted, "but I know a victim when I see one, and I know Thomas Reed." Olivia shifted slightly, and the floorboard beneath her creaked. The conversation inside stopped immediately. "Miss Walker," Hank called out, "is everything all right?" Embarrassed at being caught eavesdropping, Olivia pushed the door open fully. "I'm sorry to intrude. I couldn't sleep." Hank stood from his desk chair while Mrs. Abernathy remained seated in an armchair by the fireplace, her knitting in her lap. The study was warm and masculine, with bookshelves lining the walls and a large desk dominated by ledgers and correspondence. "Not surprising after what you've been through," Mrs. Abernathy said kindly. "Would you like some tea? There's still hot water in the kitchen." "Thank you, but no," Olivia said. She turned to Hank. "I overheard what you were discussing. I want you to know that I'm telling the truth. I never stole anything from Thomas or anyone else." Hank's expression remained neutral. "May I ask how you came to be engaged to him in the first place?" Olivia sighed and accepted Mrs. Abernathy's invitation to sit. "I came to Sioux Falls 3 months ago to work as a teacher at the school. Thomas began courting me almost immediately. He was charming at first, generous. My parents died 2 years ago, and I've been on my own since then, moving from town to town for teaching positions. I was flattered by his attention." She twisted her hands in her lap. "But as the wedding approached, he changed. He became controlling, possessive. He didn't want me teaching after we married. He didn't want me to have friends. When I tried to break the engagement, he threatened to have me fired, to ruin my reputation so no school would ever hire me again. His father owns the building where the school is housed, you see." "So you ran," Mrs. Abernathy concluded. Olivia nodded. "I packed what I could carry and tried to leave town on the morning stage. Thomas caught me at the station. That's when he accused me of stealing his mother's brooch, a family heirloom, he claimed. It was all a lie, but who would believe me over him?" Hank's expression had darkened during her story. "I believe you, Miss Walker, and I meant what I said. You're welcome to stay here until you decide what to do next." "I can't impose. It's no imposition," he insisted. "The ranch is large, and Mrs. Abernathy appreciates the company, don't you?" The housekeeper nodded emphatically. "Indeed I do. It gets lonely out here with just Mr. Jenkins and the ranch hands for conversation." Olivia looked between them, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in weeks, she felt safe. "Thank you, both of you." Later that night, as Olivia finally drifted towards sleep in the comfortable guest bed, she heard the sound of horses in the distance. Fear gripped her momentarily, but then she heard Hank's voice calling out to one of his men, and she relaxed. Whatever happened next, she wasn't alone anymore. Morning came with the sound of roosters crowing and the distant lowing of cattle. Olivia woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day came rushing back. She dressed quickly in one of the borrowed dresses, a simple blue calico that was a bit loose in the waist but otherwise fit well enough, and made her way downstairs. Mrs. Abernathy was already in the kitchen, kneading dough for bread. "Good morning, dear. Did you sleep well?" "Better than I expected," Olivia admitted, moving to help without being asked. "May I assist you with breakfast? You can set the table if you like. Mr. Jenkins usually eats early with the men, but he said he'd come in for breakfast today. I suspect he wanted to check on you." As if summoned by his name, Hank appeared in the doorway, removing his hat as he entered. He was already dusty from morning chores, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned forearms. "Morning, Mrs. Abernathy. Miss Walker." "Good morning, Mr. Jenkins," Olivia replied, suddenly self-conscious about her borrowed clothes and loose hair. She hadn't had time to properly pin it up, and it fell in waves past her shoulders. If Hank noticed her discomfort, he didn't comment. "I've sent one of my men, Charlie, into town for supplies. I asked him to inquire discreetly about what Reed might be planning, and to pick up your belongings from the boarding house, if possible." Olivia set down the plates she'd been holding. "That's very thoughtful, but I don't want to put your man in danger. Thomas might be watching for anyone connected to you." "Charlie's clever," Hank assured her. "He was a scout during the war, knows how to move without being seen when he needs to." Breakfast was a surprisingly comfortable affair. Mrs. Abernathy kept the conversation flowing with stories about the ranch and the surrounding area. Hank spoke little but was attentive, making sure Olivia's plate and cup were never empty. It struck her that this was the most relaxed meal she'd had in months. With Thomas, every dinner had been a performance, with Olivia constantly on edge, afraid of saying the wrong thing. "I was thinking," Hank said as they finished eating, "that you might want to see the ranch today, if you're feeling up to it." Surprised by the offer, Olivia nodded. "I'd like that very much." After helping Mrs. Abernathy clean up from breakfast, Olivia found Hank waiting for her on the porch with 2 horses, his own chestnut gelding and a gentle-looking gray mare. "This is Silver," he said, patting the mare's neck. "She belongs to my sister, but she's left her here since moving to California. She's good-tempered, won't give you any trouble." Olivia approached the mare cautiously. "I should warn you, I'm not an experienced rider. In Pennsylvania, we mostly traveled by carriage." Hank smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his face, softening the hard angles and making him look younger. "Silver's the perfect horse to learn on. I'll keep us at a walk." With Hank's help, Olivia mounted the mare, adjusting her borrowed dress as best she could. They set off at a leisurely pace, with Hank pointing out various features of the ranch: the creek that gave it its name, the different pastures, the small apple orchard his mother had planted years ago that was just beginning to bloom. "How many cattle do you have?" Olivia asked, starting to relax in the saddle. "About 800 head now," Hank replied. "Started with just 50 when Pa bought the land. We've been lucky with good breeding stock and fair winters." "And you manage all of this yourself?" "I have 12 full-time hands, more during roundup and branding season. And Mrs. Abernathy, of course, who runs the house better than I ever could." They rode to a hilltop that overlooked the entire valley. In the distance, they could see the glint of the river and the smoke from chimneys in Sioux Falls. It was a breathtaking view. "Your land is beautiful," Olivia said softly. "It's home," Hank replied simply. He hesitated, then added, "My father used to say that land is just dirt until you put your heart into it. Then it becomes something more." Olivia glanced at him, seeing beyond his practical exterior to the thoughtful man beneath. "Your father sounds like a wise man." He was. Hank's expression grew distant. "He brought us out here when I was 17, my sister just 14. Our mother had passed the year before. He wanted a fresh start for us all. And you've carried on his legacy, Olivia observed. He would be proud. Hank looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. I hope so. They rode in companionable silence for a while, eventually turning back toward the main house. As they approached, they saw a rider coming in from the direction of town. Charlie returning from his errand. Hank's posture immediately stiffened. Something's wrong. Charlie's pushing his horse too hard. They quickened their pace, reaching the yard just as Charlie dismounted. He was a wiry man in his 40s with a weathered face and alert eyes. He nodded respectfully to Olivia before turning to Hank. Trouble in town, boss. Reed's got the sheriff looking for Miss Walker, claiming she stole a family heirloom worth hundreds. They're offering a reward for information on her whereabouts. Olivia's hands tightened on the reins, causing Silver to sidestep nervously. Hank quickly moved to steady the mare. What else, Charlie? He prompted, sensing there was more. Charlie glanced uneasily at Olivia. Reed's been drinking since last night, telling anyone who'll listen that Jenkins stole his woman and that he aims to get her back. Got a couple of his father's hired men watching the roads leading out here. Did you manage to get Miss Walker's belongings? Charlie nodded, patting his saddlebag. Mrs. Gunderson was sympathetic once I explained the situation. Said she never believed Miss Walker was a thief, but she couldn't go against the Reeds. She packed up what was left in the room herself. Thank you, Charlie, Olivia said gratefully. What about Nathaniel Reed? Hank asked. Is he backing his son in this? That's the interesting part, Charlie said, lowering his voice. Word is the old man's furious with Thomas for causing such a scene. Apparently, this isn't the first time Thomas has accused a woman of theft when she's rejected him. Hank's jaw tightened. I need to go into town, speak with Nathaniel directly. That's too dangerous, Olivia protested. If Thomas sees you, I've known Nathaniel Reed for 15 years, Hank said firmly. He's hard-headed and proud, but he's fair. If I can convince him that his son is lying, he might call off the sheriff. And if you can't, Mrs. Abernathy had appeared on the porch, having overheard the conversation. Then we'll figure something else out, Hank said. He turned to Olivia. I won't let them take you, Miss Walker. You have my word on that. The intensity in his eyes made Olivia's heart skip a beat. This man, who barely knew her, was willing to stand against one of the most powerful families in the territory for her sake. It was more loyalty than she'd experienced from anyone in years. At least wait until tomorrow, Mrs. Abernathy suggested. Give Thomas time to sober up and perhaps come to his senses. Hank considered this, then nodded reluctantly. All right, but I'll send Miguel to keep watch on the main road. I don't want any surprises. That evening, after a tense dinner, Olivia found herself unable to sleep again. The threat hanging over her head was too immediate, too frightening. She wandered downstairs, intending to make herself a cup of tea, when she heard the faint sound of piano music coming from a room she hadn't yet entered. Following the melody, she discovered a small parlor off the main hallway. Hank sat at an upright piano, his back to the door, playing a melancholic tune she didn't recognize. She stood quietly, not wanting to interrupt the unexpected moment. His playing wasn't polished, but it was heartfelt, his large hands moving with surprising gentleness over the keys. When the piece ended, Olivia couldn't help herself. That was beautiful. Hank started slightly, turning to find her in the doorway. Miss Walker, I thought everyone was asleep. I couldn't rest, she admitted, stepping into the room. I didn't know you played. Not well, he said with a self-deprecating smile. My mother taught me as a boy. I don't practice nearly enough, but sometimes it helps clear my head. May I? She gestured to the bench, and when he nodded and moved over, she sat beside him. The bench was narrow, bringing them closer than was strictly proper, but neither commented on it. My mother taught piano as well. It was one of the few things that brought her joy after my father's business failed. Without asking permission, Olivia placed her fingers on the keys and began to play a gentle nocturne. Hank watched her hands, mesmerized by their fluid movements across the ivory. "You play beautifully," he said when she finished. "Music was the one luxury we could still afford, even when times were hard," she explained. "Just the cost of sheet music now and then." They sat in silence for a moment, the unspoken worry about tomorrow hanging between them. "I'm sorry I've brought this trouble to your door," Olivia finally said. "You didn't bring it," Hank countered. "Thomas Reed did, and I've had my share of disagreements with the Reeds before this. Still, you barely know me. You've risked so much already." Hank turned slightly on the bench to face her. "Sometimes you just know when something is the right thing to do, Miss Walker. Helping you was the right thing." Their eyes met in the dim lamplight, and for a moment, something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. Olivia found herself noticing the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the slight curl to his hair where it fell across his forehead. The spell was broken by the sound of a door closing somewhere in the house. Olivia stood quickly, suddenly aware of how improper it was to be alone with him at this hour, regardless of his honorable intentions. "I should try to sleep," she said, smoothing her borrowed robe. "Thank you for sharing your music with me, Mr. Jenkins." "Hank," he reminded her gently. "And thank you for sharing yours, Olivia." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and somehow it felt significant. A small bridge crossed between them. She smiled at him before slipping from the room, her heart beating a rhythm that had nothing to do with fear of Thomas Reed. The next morning dawned gray and threatening rain. Hank was already gone when Olivia came downstairs, having ridden out at first light to check the boundaries of his property, according to Mrs. Abernathy. "He's concerned about Reed's men watching the roads," the housekeeper explained as they worked together to prepare breakfast for the ranch hands. "He wants to make sure no one's trespassing." "I feel like a prisoner," Olivia sighed, kneading biscuit dough with more force than necessary. "This isn't fair to any of you." Mrs. Abernathy placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Life is rarely fair, dear, but it helps when good people stand together against the unfairness. Mr. Jenkins is a good man, and he recognizes that you're a good woman who's been wronged. That's all there is to it." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching, multiple horses, moving fast. Mrs. Abernathy moved to the window and gasped. "It's the sheriff with Thomas Reed and 2 deputies," she said, her voice tight with worry. "And Mr. Jenkins isn't back yet." Olivia felt the blood drain from her face. "They've come for me." "Not if I have anything to say about it," Mrs. Abernathy declared, wiping her hands on her apron. "You go upstairs, lock yourself in Mr. Jenkins's study. Use the back stairs, I'll stall them." Olivia wanted to protest, to face her accusers, but the determined look in the older woman's eyes brooked no argument. She hurried through the kitchen and up the narrow back staircase, heart pounding as she heard the heavy knock at the front door. From the study window, she could see the 4 men dismounting in the yard. Thomas looked disheveled, his normally immaculate appearance marred by what was clearly a hangover. Sheriff Daniels, a heavy-set man with a drooping mustache, seemed uncomfortable but resolute. The 2 deputies hung back, looking bored. Olivia couldn't hear what was being said at the front door, but she could imagine Mrs. Abernathy standing her ground, refusing to let them enter without a proper warrant. The confrontation seemed to go on for several minutes before the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew everyone's attention. Hank rode into the yard at a gallop, pulling his horse to a sharp stop and dismounting in one fluid motion. Even from a distance, Olivia could see the anger in his stance as he confronted the sheriff. There was more discussion, with Thomas gesturing wildly at one point, his face red with rage. Hank stood his ground, one hand resting casually near his holster, not a threat, but a reminder. To Olivia's surprise, a fifth rider appeared, approaching more sedately from the direction of town. It took her a moment to recognize Nathaniel Reid, Thomas's father. The older man dismounted stiffly, looking displeased with the entire situation. The conversation in the yard grew more intense, with Nathaniel eventually placing a restraining hand on his son's arm when Thomas lunged toward Hank. After what seemed like an eternity, the sheriff nodded and mounted his horse again. Thomas continued to argue, but his father's expression brooked no disagreement. Finally, reluctantly, Thomas mounted his own horse. Olivia held her breath as the group rode away, Thomas throwing one last venomous look at the house before spurring his horse harder than necessary. Only when they had disappeared down the road did she release the breath she'd been holding. A few minutes later, she heard Hank's voice calling her name. She unlocked the study door and hurried downstairs to find him and Mrs. Abernathy in the kitchen. "What happened?" she asked, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. "Nathaniel Reid happened," Hank said, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly at the sight of her safe and unharmed. "He arrived just in time to hear his son threatening to burn down my barn if I didn't hand you over." "Apparently, this isn't the first time Thomas has accused a woman of theft," Mrs. Abernathy added. "There was an incident in Rapid City last year that Nathaniel had to pay to keep quiet." "He believed me over his own son?" Olivia asked, disbelieving. "Not exactly," Hank clarified. "But he believed that his son was making a fool of himself and the Reid name. He's ordered Thomas to drop the charges and leave you be." And Thomas agreed. She knew Thomas too well to believe he would give up so easily. Hank and Mrs. Abernathy exchanged a look. "Nathaniel is sending Thomas to manage their mining interests in Colorado," Hank explained. "He leaves on tomorrow's stage. It wasn't a request." Relief washed over Olivia so strongly that her knees nearly buckled. Hank was at her side in an instant, guiding her to a chair. His hand lingered on her arm, warm and reassuring. "It's over," he said softly. "You're safe now." Tears pricked at Olivia's eyes. "I don't know how to thank you, all of you." "There's no need for thanks," Hank said. "I'm just glad Nathaniel Reid still has some sense of decency despite his son." That evening, with the immediate threat removed, a celebratory mood took hold of the ranch. Mrs. Abernathy prepared a special dinner and even invited Miguel and Charlie to join them at the main house. Wine was opened, toasts were made, and for the first time since arriving at Raven Creek, Olivia felt herself truly relax. After dinner, Olivia and Hank found themselves alone on the porch, watching as the sun set behind the distant hills. The air was cool but not unpleasant, scented with pine and the promise of rain. "What will you do now?" Hank asked, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Olivia considered the question. With Thomas leaving for Colorado, she could return to her teaching position in town. Or she could still go to her cousin in Cheyenne, start fresh somewhere new. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "Part of me wants to stay in Sioux Falls to prove that Thomas didn't drive me away, but another part—" "Another part?" Hank prompted when she trailed off. She turned to look at him, finding his eyes already on her. "Another part of me has found something unexpected here, something I'd like to explore further if given the chance." The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. Hank took a step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "I think you should stay," he said, his voice lower than before. "Not in town, here." Olivia's heart stuttered in her chest. "Here at the ranch." Mrs. Abernathy mentioned that the school needs a teacher for the children of the neighboring ranches. They've been meeting in the old church on Saturdays, but it's not enough. You could teach here, use one of the outbuildings. We could convert it into a proper schoolroom. It wasn't what she had expected him to say, but the thoughtfulness of the suggestion touched her deeply. You would do that, create a school on your property. I would do that and more, Hank said, his gaze intent. For the children of the area, and for you if you'll stay. The implication of his words hung in the air between them. This wasn't just about a teaching position. It was about the beginning of something neither of them had anticipated when he'd intervened on that dusty street in town. I think, Olivia said carefully, that I would like that very much. Hank's smile was slow and transformative, lighting his features in a way that made Olivia's breath catch. Emboldened, he reached out to take her hand, his calloused fingers enveloping hers. Then it's settled, he said. You'll stay at Raven Creek. Neither of them could have known then how true those words would prove to be. The weeks that followed brought changes to Raven Creek Ranch that no one, least of all Hank, could have predicted. The old grain storage building nearest the main house was cleaned out, repaired, and transformed into a schoolroom under Olivia's direction. Hank ordered proper desks and books from Omaha, and word spread quickly among the neighboring ranches that a real school was opening at Jenkins's place. By the end of the first month, Olivia had 12 students ranging in age from 6 to 15, attending 3 days a week. The other days, she helped Mrs. Abernathy with household matters and began learning about ranch operations from Hank, who seemed to find more and more reasons to include her in his daily routine. Their relationship evolved naturally, growing from mutual respect into something deeper. They shared meals, conversation, music in the evenings. Hank taught Olivia to ride properly, and she introduced him to poetry he'd never had time to read. Mrs. Abernathy watched it all with silent approval, discreetly chaperoning when needed but giving them space to discover each other. One evening in late June, nearly 2 months after Olivia's arrival at the ranch, Hank suggested a ride to show her something special. They set out after dinner, Olivia now comfortable enough on Silver to keep pace with Hank's gelding at a gentle canter. He led her to a part of the property she hadn't seen before, a hidden valley where wildflowers carpeted the ground in a riot of colors, with the creek widening into a small, clear pool before continuing its journey. It's breathtaking, Olivia said as they dismounted. The setting sun bathed everything in golden light, making the scene look like something from a painting. My mother found this spot the first week we arrived here, Hank explained, spreading a blanket he'd brought on the grass near the water. She called it her secret garden, though there's nothing cultivated about it. She said it was God's garden, perfect without human interference. They sat together, watching as fireflies began to appear in the gathering dusk. Hank seemed unusually quiet, almost nervous, a state Olivia had rarely seen him in. "What's troubling you?" she asked gently, placing her hand on his. Hank turned his hand to clasp hers. "Not troubled, just contemplating changes." "What kind of changes?" He took a deep breath. "Olivia, these past months with you at the ranch. They've been the happiest I can remember since my parents were alive. You've brought something to Raven Creek that it was missing, that I was missing." Her heart began to race as she realized where this conversation might be heading. "I've been happy too, Hank. Happier than I ever expected to be again after everything with Thomas." Hank's expression darkened briefly at the mention of Reed's name. Thomas had indeed left for Colorado as his father ordered, but his parting words to several people in town had made it clear. He still considered Olivia a thief, and Hank a woman stealer. Fortunately, With Nathaniel Reed publicly supporting Hank's version of events, most townspeople had chosen to believe the better story. "I don't want to rush you," Hank continued, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. "I know it hasn't been that long since you escaped a bad situation. But I also don't want to wait to tell you how I feel, how I've come to feel about you." He shifted to face her directly, still holding her hand. "I love you, Olivia. I think I started falling in love with you that first night at the piano, maybe even before that. And if you need more time before considering a future together, I understand. But I wanted you to know where I stand." Tears welled in Olivia's eyes, but they were tears of joy. "Hank Jenkins, for a man of few words, you certainly know how to use them when it matters." His expression was a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "Is that a good sign?" In answer, Olivia leaned forward and kissed him softly. It was their first kiss, sweet and tentative at first, then deepening as Hank's arms came around her, drawing her closer. When they finally parted, both breathing a little faster, Olivia smiled. "I love you too, Hank. I wasn't looking for love when I came here, but it found me anyway in you." The joy that spread across his face was something Olivia knew she would remember for the rest of her life. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I've been carrying this around for a week, waiting for the right moment," he admitted. "It was my mother's." He opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring with a small but perfect diamond, flanked by 2 tiny sapphires. "Olivia Walker, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, of making Raven Creek your permanent home?" "Yes," she said without hesitation, her heart too full for elaborate speeches. "Yes, I will marry you, Hank Jenkins." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, then sealed their engagement with another kiss, Olivia knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just safety at Raven Creek Ranch, but her true home. News of their engagement spread quickly through Sioux Falls and the surrounding ranches. Most reactions were positive. Hank was well respected in the community, and Olivia had made a good impression with her teaching and her quiet dignity in the face of Thomas Reed's accusations. They planned a September wedding, allowing time for Hank's sister Elizabeth to travel from California with her husband and children. The entire ranch threw itself into preparations, with Mrs. Abernathy directing operations like a general commanding troops. In mid-July, however, their happiness was tested when a letter arrived from Colorado. Thomas Reed had died in a mining accident, or so the official story went. The private note from Nathaniel Reed to Hank told a different tale. Thomas had been killed in a saloon fight after accusing another man's fiancé of theft. History repeating itself, with tragic results. The news affected Olivia more than she had expected. Though she had no love for Thomas, she hadn't wished him dead. She spent a restless night pondering how different her life might have been if she had given in to his demands, if Hank hadn't intervened that day in town. Hank found her the next morning in the schoolroom, staring out the window at the distant mountains. He approached quietly, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin on the top of her head. "Regrets?" he asked softly. Olivia leaned back against his solid warmth. "Not about us. Never about us, just thinking about how life turns on such small moments. If you hadn't been in town that day." "But I was," Hank said firmly. "And you fought back against Reed long before I stepped in. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Olivia." She turned in his arms to face him. "I'm stronger with you beside me." Hank kissed her forehead gently. "We're stronger together. That's how it should be between husband and wife." The weeks leading up to their wedding were busy but joyful. Elizabeth arrived with her family 2 weeks before the ceremony, filling the main house with the laughter of her 3 children, and bringing a feminine touch to the wedding preparations that Mrs. Abernathy, practical as she was, couldn't provide. Elizabeth took to Olivia immediately, declaring that her brother had finally found someone who could match his stubbornness with sense. The two women became fast friends, staying up late into the night talking while Hank and Elizabeth's husband, James, discussed ranch business. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, with just enough crispness in the air to hint at the coming fall. The ceremony was held at Raven Creek, in the wildflower valley that had become their special place. The ranch hands had constructed benches for the guests, and an arbor of twisted branches where Olivia and Hank would exchange their vows. Olivia wore a gown of ivory silk that Elizabeth had helped her choose on a trip to Sioux Falls. Her copper hair was adorned with wildflowers, and she carried a bouquet of late-blooming roses from Mrs. Abernathy's garden. As she walked toward Hank, who stood waiting with the minister from town, Olivia felt a sense of rightness so profound it brought tears to her eyes. The vows were simple but heartfelt. When Hank promised to love and cherish her for all his days, his voice rang with such sincerity that several of the assembled guests discreetly wiped away tears. Olivia's own voice remained steady as she made the same promises in return, her eyes never leaving his. The celebration afterward lasted well into the night, with tables set up in the yard, lanterns hanging from the trees, and one of the ranch hands playing fiddle for dancing. Olivia moved from guest to guest, now officially the mistress of Raven Creek Ranch, her heart so full she thought it might burst. Later that night, when they were finally alone in the master bedroom that was now theirs to share, Hank took her hands in his expression serious despite the joy of the day. "I want you to know something," he said. "This ranch, everything I have, it's ours now together. I've had papers drawn up to make sure that if anything happens to me, Raven Creek goes to you, not to some distant cousin or the bank." Olivia was touched by his thoughtfulness, though the idea of losing him was too painful to contemplate. "Nothing's going to happen to you. We have too many plans for our future." "Even so," he insisted, "I want you to know that you'll never have to leave this place, Olivia. This is your home now for as long as you want it." She reached up to touch his face, his stubble rough against her palm. "I'm never leaving, Hank Jenkins. You're stuck with me now." His serious expression melted into a smile, and he pulled her closer. "That's exactly how I want it to be, Mrs. Jenkins. Exactly how I want it to be." The years that followed were not without challenges. Drought threatened the cattle one summer, and harsh blizzards the next winter trapped them in the house for weeks. The school on the ranch grew, eventually requiring a proper building in town and an assistant for Olivia. Through it all, their partnership remained strong, each challenge faced together. Their first child, a son they named William after Hank's father, arrived exactly 1 year after their wedding, almost to the day. Elizabeth joked that Hank had planned it that way, always efficient in his timing. Olivia had never seen her husband as overcome with emotion as when he first held his son, his large hands cradling the tiny infant with infinite care. A daughter, Margaret, followed 2 years later, with her mother's copper hair and her father's determined nature. Then another son, Joseph, completed their family 3 years after that. The children grew up with the freedom of the ranch, learning to ride almost before they could walk, helping with age-appropriate chores, and absorbing their parents' values of hard work, honesty, and compassion. Olivia continued to teach, though she scaled back her hours after Joseph's birth. Her little school had grown into the official Sioux Falls School, with a proper building in town funded in large part by Nathaniel Reed, who seemed determined to make amends for his son's actions in whatever way he could. Olivia served on the school board, helping to shape education in the growing community. Hank expanded the ranch operations, breeding horses as well as cattle, and establishing Raven Creek as one of the most successful spreads in the territory. He was asked to serve on the territorial council several times but always declined, preferring to focus on his family and his land. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Hank surprised Olivia with a trip to San Francisco to visit Elizabeth, who had been widowed the year before. It was the first time either of them had traveled so far from Raven Creek since their marriage, leaving William, now a capable young man of 19, in charge with Mrs. Abernathy's supervision. The journey was an adventure for them both, a chance to see a world that had changed dramatically in the decades since they'd settled into their life together. They attended the opera, dined in fine restaurants, and walked along the bustling waterfront, marveling at ships from distant lands. But as their visit drew to a close, both admitted they were eager to return home. Elizabeth noticed their restlessness and smiled knowingly. "Raven Creek has its hooks in you both," she said over their farewell dinner. "I remember how it felt, how it still feels when I visit. There's something special about that land." "It's more than the land," Hank said, his hand finding Olivia's under the table. "It's what we've built there together." On their last night in San Francisco, standing on the balcony of their hotel room overlooking the bay, Olivia leaned against her husband's solid frame, his arms wrapped around her just as they had been countless times over the years. "Happy?" he asked, his voice a deep rumble she felt as much as heard. "Completely," she assured him, "but ready to go home." 20 years, Hank mused. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I saw you being dragged through town by Raid. Other times it feels like you've always been part of Raven Creek, like the creek itself or the mountains beyond." Olivia turned in his arms to face him. Though his hair was now streaked with silver and lines had deepened around his eyes, he was still the same Hank who had ridden to her rescue that day, still the same man who had brought her to his ranch and into his heart. "I'm glad you stepped in that day," she said. "And I'm even more glad I never left." "Never will if I have anything to say about it," Hank replied, bending to kiss her with the same tenderness he always showed, the passion between them undiminished by the years. As they returned to Raven Creek the following week, the familiar landscape spreading out before them like a welcome, Olivia knew they had been extraordinarily blessed. The young woman being dragged through town all those years ago could never have imagined the life awaiting her, a life of love, family, purpose, and deep belonging. Hank reached across the carriage to take her hand as the ranch came into view. The main house now expanded to accommodate their growing family. The buildings multiplied, the herd visible in the distance, a legacy they had built together. "Welcome home, Mrs. Jenkins," he said, the words as meaningful now as they had been on their wedding day. "Home," Olivia echoed, squeezing his hand. "For always." And it was. Neither Olivia nor Hank ever left Raven Creek Ranch again, except for occasional visits to their children as they grew and established their own lives. William eventually took over the ranch operations, allowing his parents to enjoy their later years in the home they had shared for so long. When visitors came to Sioux Falls in later years, they would sometimes hear the story of how Hank Jenkins had rescued a copper-haired schoolteacher from a cruel man's grasp, how she had never left his ranch again, and how their love had become the stuff of local legend. But for Hank and Olivia, it wasn't legend, it was simply the life they had chosen day by day, year by year, together at Raven Creek Ranch.